Hello everybody and welcome to another video tutorial. Now for this week's tutorial you guys voted and you guys chose for me to paint a steampunk werewolf. So obviously I'm a big fan of steampunk in general. I love the style. It's always an interesting challenge too, which is also why I like it. So this was super fun to work on. Now the key thing for this image was to get a very interesting pose for the character. So when I'm first figuring out the pose, I'm not initially worried about the details that I'm going to add into it. I generally work out the anatomy first, and then from that I modify and take out portions of the actual anatomy so that I can replace it with normally electronics. This gives me a more solid foundation from which to work on, and gives me a more realistic feel. Now, since I wanted to have the werewolf essentially running towards the viewer, the key thing was to essentially help show the motion. And the best way to do this was actually to tilt him forward, because essentially when you're running, you're actually falling to a certain degree forward and catching yourself before you actually face plant onto the ground. So keeping that general concept in mind when I was working on this, I took it further from that. Now, since this werewolf does have electronic portions that's been added to him, it didn't make all that much sense to actually have him be able to transform back. So the clothing designs that I've added onto him are more geared to help facilitate his motion in his form. Because at this point he's not able to go back to his human form because of all the modifications. It's essentially made those changes actually permanent. So he's essentially been genetically modified at this point to have werewolf-like features. So a really big focus point was to get the muzzle in the correct perspective. Because of the slightly forward angle of the face, I did need to spend actually quite a bit of time figuring out how I was going to pose out the face to get that angle. So obviously I was looking at reference material. It's always a key thing. And once I had the reference material, it did make it a lot easier to figure out the pose for the face. So once I roughed out the major areas that I wanted to include in major details, I used a soft default round brush to essentially add the basic shadows. Now at this point, and highlights, but at this point I'm using a more textured brush to add or insinuate some of the detail. At the end of this video, you're actually going to see me use the default round brush to add further detail and highlights, and you'll see why I end up doing that later on. But to begin with, as you can see, I'm just using the texture brush that I've been using for the past couple of videos to add the detailed information. So since I already have essentially all the hard stuff done, at this point it's just adding in some of the detail, figuring out the proper structure, and really making sure that it shows as I'm shading in different portions. Once again, I'm not worrying about the color at this point in time, mainly because it's really easy to change the colors near the end or at any point in time once you have a solid foundation from which to work on. So I'm not worrying about those colors. I am worried about essentially getting the structure correct and making sure that I can actually show that things are curved, that they have substance, they have muscle mass to everything. So that's more of the primary focus at this point. This entire image took approximately 5 hours to complete, so it wasn't too long of an image, even though it had quite a bit of detail that was required to get it to look correct and finalized. And it was really a really fun piece, actually, just because I got to add a lot of... I love drawing human anatomy, so obviously that's something I enjoy. But I got to really push some of the posing, which was always really fun, and experiment a bit with simplifying some of the detail work so that they still read correctly, but more of insinuated the details. So I'm just working on some of the background elements. I'm still using the same brush at this point. I haven't transitioned to the other brush yet. and I'm just making sure everything lines up in perspective, and I'm really adding just rough information. The detail in the background is not necessary, but it does help balance out the overall composition. So it is important that I actually balance out essentially the level of detail that's in the character to the background elements. Now at this point I'm using the default round brush to add highlights to the image, and because doing this process actually tends to wash out some of the existing detail, I have to go in afterwards and I have to actually go and bump up the detail further. I'm doing this only after I've changed colors and modified some of the colors within the piece though. I find it's easier because then when you sample it you get more of an accurate depiction of the image that you want to create. So I am adding in the details all with the default round brush, essentially set at a very small size to get that information to show. But you can really see how just like bumping up certain key areas really does help add quite a bit of information to the overall painting. And I'm not adding too much information, it's just slight highlights here and there that help insinuate some of the detail and really help give weight to areas that would essentially have much more muscle mass or structurally have more mass in general. Just adding the tail, working up the muscles in the leg, and adding a bit more information for the face and the background elements. Now I decided to have essentially projectiles being shot at to the werewolf. The reason for that is I needed to give a reason for why he would be running forward. He's attempting to pursue his attacker, so he has a purpose. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I hope to see you guys soon, so thank you and take care.